South Africans will now have to dig deeper into their pockets to fill a revenue shortfall in order to fund fee-free higher education. Finance Minister Malusi Gigaba yesterday allocated an additional funding of 57 billion rand to fee-free higher education. Late last year, former President Jacob Zuma announced that tertiary education would be free in public institutions for students from poor and low-income families. For more on this, I'm joined by Professor Raymond Parsons from the Northwest University Business School. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News. Let's start with this 57.1 billion rand allocated to higher education. Will it be enough and is it sustainable?
Good afternoon. I think one of the phrases one must use about this budget, and also if one talks about what's going to be put into education, is its inevitability. That's why I'm a little bit surprised that so many people are upset, because already in the mini-budget you could see what the numbers then were, and then subsequently we've had the decision about higher education. And that has dominated the numbers in the budget. That budget would have been looked very different if we hadn't had to find that money, and hence the increase in the VAT rate. But it's an important decision, and it's a large sum of money. And it's going to be phased in over time, which is good, so that we can absorb the cost over time, that we can also monitor how it's being implemented, because I think the taxpayer is going to say, yes, I'm very happy to see these funds going into higher education, but I want to see value for money. I want to see that it's well invested, not going to be wasted, that those who are going to get it will be held accountable, will show outcomes. And the second point, I think, which is important, that although at the moment the focus is on tertiary education, which is, of course, very essentially important, we must also pay attention to the foundations, and that is primary education, because things will go wrong at the tertiary level if you haven't got them right at the primary level. So I hope that in our desire to make a success of the money that we want to put into tertiary education, we don't overlook that the foundations of our primary education are essential to make a success of all the extra things we want to do at the higher level.
Minister Gigaba didn't leave out basic education institutions, setting aside 31.7 billion rand just for upgrading school structures, getting rid of schools that are what he called inappropriate, I think, and making sure that there is a balance there. Is that figure, alongside with the money from the feeding schemes, adequate to ensure that these problems don't crop up by the time that people get to higher education institutions?
I think that the real problem at the primary level is not so much funds or indeed money, although it's always nice to have more of it. We as a country spend among the largest proportion of our GDP on education. And why I'm raising this point is that as we now decide how are we going to spend this 57 billion and the 31 billion for the primary education, we simply got to say, what is it in the structure that is not giving us a sufficient return? Why is it that the more money we put on, the more complaints we have? So there's something structural there, and that we must decide, as we now have this watershed decision, that we're going to look at the educational system in a way that will restructure it to give us better value. Because we can see, why have we had this budget? Because the Treasury has its back to the wall. It won't be possible to do these things next year and the year after unless we very successfully turn this economy around. But investing in education is part of that. But then we've got to get value for money. We've got to say, what is it in the structure of either primary or tertiary education that doesn't give us the returns we want? And can we settle these complaints that we get about the outputs are not what they ought to be, given the huge amount of money we are already investing in education?
Minister Gigaba spoke about also the conversion of NSFAS loans into bursaries for returning students in 2018, and said that it's important that people break the cycle of poverty that's obviously linked to structural inequality in South Africa, and a way of breaking that pattern is to ensure that people do get educated so they can go out and find employment. With this raft of money coming in, we know there's going to be benefits. We know that people who are educated can also break the cycle of poverty. How sustainable is it, and how long do we have to wait to see returns on this budget and on these things that are being implemented?
We must remind ourselves that we have got a national development plan. And if your memory is good, you will recall that its top three priorities were education, unemployment, and state capacity. Those are still our three priorities. And what they said was, this country, apart from your financial deficits and your trust deficits, you have this huge skills deficit that is feeding the poverty and the inability of people to break out of the poverty trap. So we've got to re-engineer our educational system in such a way, at the primary and at the tertiary level, that we develop the skills that our economy needs. And that's a very important test for making best use of the funds that have been allocated.
Professor Raymond Parsons from Northwest University, thanks so much for your time on SABC News. It's time for a short break. We'll have more news for you when we come back. Please stay with us.